If the Western Front became a war of inches, the Eastern Front became a war of miles. In the East, the front did not freeze into a continuous line of trenches stretching from sea to border. It bent, stretched, and shifted across enormous distances through forests, plains, marshes, and villages that rarely appeared on Western maps. Armies did not face one another across narrow strips of no man's land. They collided, separated, regrouped, and collided again. Here, entire armies could disappear from view for days. Front lines were often suggestions rather than fixed realities. Commanders struggled not just with enemy resistance, but with geography, infrastructure, and sheer scale. A single engagement on the Eastern Front could unfold across hundreds of miles. And when things went wrong, they went wrong catastrophically. Millions of men were swept into a war that moved faster than supplies, faster than communication, and often faster than understanding. Victories were decisive. Defeats were annihilating. Retreats turned into collapses. For Russia in particular, the Eastern Front would become a crucible exposing weaknesses that had long been hidden by size and tradition, and placing unbearable strain on a society already under pressure. This was not a quieter war. It was a looser one. And in that looseness lay both opportunity and disaster. My name is James, and this is Echoes of the Great War, Episode 5. In the last episode, we watched the Western Front freeze into place as movement gave way to trenches and endurance replaced maneuver. But while the war in the West settled into stalemate, the war in the East followed a very different path. In this episode, we'll step back and take in the sheer scale of the Eastern Front, the distances involved, the challenges of command, and the kinds of battles that could unfold when lines were thin and movement was still possible. We'll slow down to examine one of the most decisive early engagements of the war, the Battle of Tannenberg, seen through the eyes of German planners who exploited Russian weaknesses with devastating effect. Then we'll turn to Russia itself, to the structural problems that undermined its war effort, and to the experience of the peasant soldiers who made up the bulk of its army. And finally, we'll step back and ask why the war in the East was so different from the war in the West, and why those differences mattered not just for military outcomes, but for the fate of empires. The Eastern Front would not freeze. It would stretch, strain, and eventually snap. To understand the war in the East, the first thing you have to do is widen the map, then widen it again. The Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north, through modern-day Poland and Ukraine, down toward the Carpathian Mountains and the Balkans. It crossed forests, marshes, rivers, and open plains that offered little natural protection and even less infrastructure. This was not a front measured in trenches separated by yards. It was a front measured in days of marching. In the West, armies operated within a dense web of railways, roads, and communication lines. In the East, those networks thinned dramatically. Rail lines were fewer, often single track, and built to different gauges depending on which empire had laid them. Roads were frequently unpaved, turning into mud after rain and dust in dry weather. Distance was not just geography, it was friction. For commanders, this meant that control was always imperfect. Orders took longer to arrive. Reports were outdated by the time they were read. Units could move for days without clear knowledge of where friendly forces ended and enemy forces began. Front lines blurred, and in that blur, entire armies could maneuver or vanish. Russia entered the war with enormous numerical strength. Its army mobilized millions of men, drawn largely from rural villages scattered across a vast empire. On paper, this scale appeared overwhelming. In practice, it was unwieldy. In August 1914, Russian forces moved aggressively into East Prussia, a region in northeastern Germany bordered by the Baltic Sea. Two Russian armies advanced on separate axes, believing that speed and pressure could overwhelm German defenses before they could fully respond. The advance itself revealed the scale of the Eastern Front. Russian units marched across wide expanses of countryside, often with minimal coordination between columns. Communication between the two armies was limited, sometimes relying on unsecured radio transmissions or couriers traveling long distances. German forces, by contrast, were operating closer to home, with shorter supply lines and more reliable rail connections. Though outnumbered initially, they could move forces rapidly along interior lines, shifting units to meet threats as they emerged. The result was not a single continuous battle, but a series of movements, engagements, and counter-movements unfolding across hundreds of miles. Smaller battles flared and faded. Cavalry skirmishes probed flanks. Advance guards clashed at river crossings and rail junctions. Villages changed hands without ever appearing in official communiques. This was war as motion, but motion carried risk. When Russian armies pushed forward, gaps opened between units. Flanks extended beyond support, supply trains lagged behind infantry, and artillery struggled to keep pace over poor roads. German commanders watched these movements carefully. They understood that the Eastern Front rewarded flexibility and punished overextension. Where the West demanded endurance, the East demanded awareness. This pattern repeated itself across the front. In Galicia, a region spanning parts of modern-day Poland and western Ukraine, Austro-Hungarian forces clashed with Russian armies in a series of massive engagements in late August and early September. Here again, scale defined experience. Battles involved hundreds of thousands of men spread across enormous fronts, with commanders often unable to see or even reliably communicate with large portions of their forces. Victories were dramatic. Defeats were devastating. A breakthrough in one sector could unravel an entire army group, forcing retreats that covered dozens or even hundreds of miles. Unlike the West, where withdrawal often meant slipping back to the next trench line, retreat in the East meant abandoning territory wholesale. Cities were evacuated. Supplies were destroyed. Civilians fled alongside soldiers. Movement did not stop. It accelerated. For soldiers, this produced a different kind of exhaustion. Long marches replaced static misery. Men slept in fields, barns, or roadside ditches. Units lost cohesion as stragglers fell behind. Food shortages were common not because supplies did not exist, but because they could not arrive fast enough. The scale of the front also shaped how violence was experienced. In the West, the enemy was always close visible across wire and mud. In the East, contact was intermittent. Days might pass without engagement, followed by sudden, intense clashes that overwhelmed units unprepared for immediate combat. This unpredictability strained morale. A Russian officer later wrote, "We marched for days without seeing the enemy, and then suddenly found ourselves under fire from all sides. It felt less like a battle than like walking into a storm." The Eastern Front also exposed the limits of imperial control. Russian armies moved through regions populated by Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Jews, and others whose loyalties were complex and often suspect in the eyes of imperial authorities. Austro-Hungarian forces faced similar challenges, operating in territories with mixed ethnic populations and fragile political allegiances. This added another layer of instability. Logistics were complicated not just by distance, but by mistrust. Intelligence was unreliable. Occupation bred resentment. Armies were forced to divert attention away from the front to manage territory behind them. By the end of 1914, it was already clear that the Eastern Front would not resemble the Western Front. It would not settle into a fixed line. It would not freeze neatly. Instead, it would swing between advance and collapse, victory and disaster in ways that magnified both success and failure. Where the West trapped armies in place, the East exposed them. And in that exposure lay the conditions for some of the most dramatic and consequential moments of the entire war. To understand why the Eastern Front could produce catastrophes so quickly, we need to slow down and look closely at one battle, not as legend, but as logistics, movement, and numbers colliding. Tannenberg. Late August 1914 in East Prussia, a region in northeastern Germany bordered by the Baltic Sea. At the outset, the situation looked dire for Germany. Russia had committed roughly 2 full-field armies to the invasion of East Prussia together, numbering around 400,000 men. These were not small probing forces. They represented a serious attempt to overwhelm German defenses before Germany could fully concentrate its strength. The Russian First Army, under General Paul von Rennenkampf, advanced from the northeast with roughly 200,000 troops. To the south, General Alexander Samsonov's Second Army pushed forward with approximately 150 to 200,000 men, depending on how units are counted. Facing them was Germany's Eighth Army. It numbered around 150,000 troops. On paper, Germany was outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. If those Russian armies coordinated effectively, the outcome could have been disastrous. But German planners understood something critical about the Eastern Front. Numbers only matter if they can be brought to bear at the same time and place. And in 1914, that was far from guaranteed. The Russian advance unfolded across enormous distances. The two armies marched on separate axes, separated by lakes, forests, and poor roads. Communication between them was limited and often unreliable. In some cases, Russian orders were transmitted by radio without encryption, a vulnerability the Germans quickly exploited. German officers intercepted these messages. They could see where Russian units were moving and, just as importantly, where they were not. This revealed a growing gap between the two Russian armies, a gap measuring dozens of miles. The German advantage was mobility. Although outnumbered, German forces operated on interior lines, supported by railways that allowed units to shift laterally far faster than Russian infantry could march. Trains moved divisions from one threatened sector to another in hours rather than days. German planners realized they could not fight both Russian armies at once, but they might destroy one before the other could intervene. That decision crystallized when German command shifted in the east. General Paul von Hindenburg arrived as overall commander, with General Erich Ludendorff as his chief of staff, while an experienced operations officer, Max Hoffmann, shaped the plan in detail. Their objective was clear: concentrate against Samsonov's Second Army. Destroy it. Samsonov's force, numbering roughly 150,000 men, was advancing through the Masurian Lakes region, a landscape of forests, marshes, and narrow roads. This terrain restricted movement and made coordination difficult, especially for large formations. German planners began moving divisions by rail, stripping forces from the north and west to form a tightening arc around Samsonov's advancing columns. Infantry, artillery, and cavalry were repositioned with remarkable speed, given the scale of the operation. For Samsonov, the situation did not immediately appear catastrophic. His army continued advancing, believing pressure would force the Germans to retreat. He did not realize how quickly German forces were concentrating against him, or how exposed his flanks had become. By the 26th and 27th of August, German units began striking the Russian flanks with increasing force. At first, these engagements looked like heavy fighting rather than encirclement. Russian units resisted fiercely. Some counterattacked. But gradually, the pattern became unmistakable. German forces were closing the exits. As the net tightened, the numerical advantage flipped. German planners concentrated around 100,000 troops against isolated Russian formations that could not support one another. Russian divisions found themselves fighting piecemeal, unable to coordinate effectively across the collapsing front. Once encirclement took hold, the scale of disaster accelerated. Retreat was not orderly. Roads clogged with men, wagons, artillery, and wounded. Communications broke down. Units became separated and disoriented in forested terrain. By the 29th and 30th of August, the Second Russian Army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent force. The numbers are stark. Out of roughly 150,000 Russian troops engaged, around 90,000 were captured, Between 30 and 50,000 were killed or wounded, and only a fraction escaped intact. German losses, by comparison, were far lower, approximately 10 to 15,000 killed and wounded, depending on the accounting. This disparity is not a measure of bravery. It is a measure of structure. German forces had not merely won a battle. They had annihilated an army. Samsonov himself, overwhelmed by the scale of the defeat and its implications, withdrew into the countryside and took his own life. His death underscores the psychological weight commanders carried. Defeat was not abstract. It was personal, moral, and absolute. Tannenberg became a German triumph almost immediately. It was celebrated in newspapers, used to bolster morale, and framed as proof of German military superiority. But it is important to understand what Tannenberg did and did not mean. It did not decide the war. It did not knock Russia out. What it did was reveal the nature of the Eastern Front. Here, battles could be decisive because the conditions allowed them to be. Thin lines, vast spaces, limited infrastructure, and fragile coordination meant that once momentum shifted, it could become unstoppable. For Russia, Tannenberg exposed vulnerabilities that numbers alone could not fix. Enormous manpower could not compensate for logistical strain, communication failures, and rigid command structures operating across impossible distances. For Germany, it offered proof that skillful planning and mobility could overcome numerical inferiority, at least temporarily. But it also set expectations dangerously high. It encouraged the belief that decisive victories were achievable in the East, even as the war ground on and costs mounted elsewhere. Tannenberg was not just a battle. It was a warning delivered early. On the Eastern Front, success and failure would not arrive gradually. They would arrive all at once. Tannenberg was not a freak accident. It was an exposure of the realities of the Eastern Front. What the battle revealed was not simply a failure of command in a single moment, but a set of structural weaknesses that had been present in the Russian war effort from the beginning, weaknesses that size alone could not compensate for. Russia entered World War I with the largest army in Europe. Millions of men were mobilized in the opening months, drawn from villages, farms, and towns scattered across an empire that stretched from Eastern Europe deep into Asia. On paper, this manpower seemed decisive. In practice, it created problems as quickly as it solved them. The first was logistics. Russia's transportation network was thin even by early 20th century standards. Rail lines were sparse, often single track, and frequently built to different gauges than those used in Western Europe. This meant that rolling stock could not be easily shared with allies, and supplies bottlenecked quickly as trains piled up behind limited infrastructure. An army does not move on numbers alone. It moves on food, ammunition, boots, rifles, and replacement parts, all of which had to travel long distances over fragile systems. Russian soldiers often marched faster than their supplies could follow, arriving at the front hungry, under-equipped, and uncertain when resupply would come. A Russian officer wrote in late 1914, "The men are willing, but they are tired and often unfed. We advance because we are ordered to, but we do not know how long we can continue like this." The second weakness was communication. Russian command struggled to coordinate forces across vast distances. Field telephones were limited. Radio technology was still developing and, as seen at Tannenberg, often insecure. Couriers traveled for days carrying messages that were obsolete by the time they arrived. This created a dangerous lag between decision and reality. Orders issued from headquarters assumed conditions that no longer existed. Units advanced or retreated based on information that was hours or days out of date. Commanders were often forced to make decisions based on intuition rather than reliable intelligence. In such an environment, coordination between armies was fragile at best. The third weakness lay in training and leadership. Russia possessed capable officers and dedicated soldiers, but its military education system struggled to keep pace with the scale of mobilization. Rapid expansion meant that many junior officers were undertrained, and non-commissioned officer corps, crucial for maintaining cohesion under stress, was comparatively weak. This mattered enormously on the Eastern Front, where units frequently operated independently, far from higher command. When confusion set in, there were fewer experienced leaders at the small unit level to adapt quickly. Orders were followed rigidly, even when circumstances had changed, because deviation carried risk in a hierarchical system that valued obedience. The fourth weakness was industrial capacity. Unlike Germany, Britain, or France, Russia entered the war without a fully modernized industrial base capable of sustaining prolonged, high-intensity conflict. Arms production lagged behind demand. Artillery shells were rationed. Rifles were sometimes shared between soldiers, with men waiting behind the lines for weapons to become available. This was not immediately catastrophic. Early battles were often decided before shortages became decisive, but over time, the strain mounted. Each engagement consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. The fifth weakness was social. The Russian army was a mirror of Russian society, and that society was deeply unequal. The majority of soldiers were peasants with limited education, little connection to the state, and few reasons to feel loyalty beyond their immediate community. This did not mean they lacked courage. It meant that the war's purpose was abstract. When victories were rare and losses heavy, morale suffered quickly. Rumors spread faster than official information. Distrust of officers, many of whom came from different social classes, deepened. A soldier later recalled, "We did not know why we were fighting in these places. We only knew that we were far from home and that men kept disappearing." The war magnified these tensions. As casualties mounted and conditions deteriorated, the army became not just a fighting force, but a pressure chamber for grievances that had existed long before 1914. Hunger, exhaustion, and confusion did not create discontent, they revealed it. Another critical weakness was strategic clarity. Russian war aims were broad and often contradictory. Support for Serbia, influence in the Balkans, access to warm water ports, and alliance obligations all competed for attention. This made it difficult to prioritize resources or concentrate effort decisively. The result was overextension. Russian forces fought simultaneously against Germany in the north and Austria-Hungary in the south, stretching already strained systems even thinner. Success in one area often came at the expense of vulnerability in another. This was not unique to Russia. All great powers struggled with competing demands, but Russia's margin for error was smaller. The Eastern Front punished mistakes quickly, and when mistakes occurred, recovery was harder. Perhaps most importantly, Russia lacked flexibility. Its size created inertia. Once mobilized, enormous forces were difficult to redirect. Plans were slow to change. Retreats became chaotic. Adjustments that might have been manageable for smaller, more agile armies became crises when applied to millions of men spread across vast distances. This rigidity turned defeats into disasters. Tannenberg demonstrated this brutally, but it was not the last time the pattern would repeat. Over the next 2 years, Russian forces would experience cycles of advance and collapse, each one eroding confidence at the front and stability at home. It is important to emphasize that these weaknesses did not make defeat inevitable. Russia continued to fight. It adapted in places. It endured staggering losses. But the war in the East was unforgiving. Where the Western Front trapped armies in stalemate, the Eastern Front exposed structural flaws and magnified them. For Russia, World War I became not just a military challenge, but a stress test of the entire imperial system. And the system was already cracking. To understand Russia's war, we can't stay at the level of rail gauges, staff maps, and production totals, even though those things mattered enormously. We need to follow the war the way most Russian soldiers encountered it, from the bottom up. So picture a young man from a village in central Russia. in a farming region hundreds of miles from the front. He is a peasant by background, which in the Russian Empire means that land and labor define nearly everything about his life. He knows seasons and soil. He knows hunger when harvests fail. He knows authority as something distant and usually unchangeable. Then, in late summer 1914, the war reaches him in the form of paper and ritual, a notice, a list, a summons. He is told to report to a local collection point with whatever he can carry, and he arrives with the only practical things he owns: spare cloth, maybe a small icon, perhaps bread wrapped in linen, and a certainty that whatever comes next will not be negotiated. He does not have a clear mental picture of East Prussia or Galicia, regions in Eastern Europe near the western edge of the Russian Empire, but he understands that he is being sent west and that the state expects obedience. The first stage of his war is movement. Rail cars packed with men, long hours standing because there is no room to sit, smoke and sweat and the sour smell of too many bodies in one place. Conversations and dialects he struggles to understand because the empire is large and the army is a cross-section of it. Sometimes the mood is confident. Sometimes it is anxious. Often it is simply quiet, because it is hard to be brave about something you cannot picture. When the trains stop, the marching begins. This is where the scale of the Eastern Front makes itself felt. The distances are enormous and the infrastructure is thin, so armies rely on men's legs to bridge gaps that rail cannot cover. Roads are often unpaved, which means dry weather turns them into dust and rain turns them into mud, and both conditions grind down morale in different ways. Food becomes uncertain early. Not always because supplies do not exist, but because supplies cannot arrive on time, so the soldier learns to eat when there is food and endure when there is not. He learns to keep bread dry if he can, and he learns that wet bread is still bread. Equipment varies. Some men have proper boots, some have boots that do not fit, some have footwear that is barely footwear at all. Uniforms are issued, but not always in the right size and not always in good condition because mobilization is enormous and the system strains to clothe it. Rifles are not always plentiful. This is one of those details that becomes almost unbelievable later. But the Russian army's expansion outpaced its ability to arm every man properly. So shortages and delays were real, and they mattered because a soldier without a weapon is not a soldier. He is a body waiting for a weapon. Then, at some point, the war becomes sound. Artillery at a distance, like a door slamming somewhere far away again and again. Rifle fire crackling in bursts, commands shouted, repeated, misunderstood, shouted again. He realizes quickly that battle is not the clean exchange of fire he might have imagined because it is mostly confusion shaped by fear, and fear moves faster than instruction. His first engagement is likely not a single dramatic charge. It is more often a collision, a sudden encounter where his unit is told to advance, then told to stop, then told to advance again, while no one at his level really knows where the enemy is, how many there are, or what the plan is beyond continuing forward. And this is where Russia's structural weaknesses become personal. Communication is uneven, so orders arrive late or contradict one another, and the soldier feels the army's uncertainty as physical motion without clear purpose. Logistics are strained, so ammunition may be limited, and men are told to conserve bullets in a battle that does not feel like it will pause for conservation. Leadership is inconsistent, so some officers inspire trust, while others seem as lost as the men they command. The Eastern Front amplifies all of this because it is not a tight line. It is a broad, shifting zone. That means a unit can be pushed forward too far and then find itself exposed, with flanks open and support uncertain, while the landscape offers few clear markers for what behind and ahead even mean. Retreat, when it comes, is worse. In the West, retreat often means falling back to another prepared position. In the east, retreat can mean miles of movement under pressure, with roads clogged by wagons, exhausted men, and frightened civilians trying to flee before the front reaches them. The soldier sees villages emptied in haste. He sees abandoned carts. He sees livestock wandering without owners. He sees, in other words, that the war does not simply pass through land. It rearranges it. And psychologically, something begins to happen. At first, his loyalty is local to comrades, to the man beside him, to the officer he trusts if he has one, because the state is distant and the war's purpose is abstract. As losses mount, that local loyalty becomes the main reason he keeps moving, because large ideas like empire and prestige do not feed you or keep you warm while the man beside you might. He also begins to learn a new relationship to time. Days blur. Weeks lose definition. News from home arrives rarely, and when it arrives, it feels like it belongs to another life. The future shrinks to the next meal, the next halt, the next chance to sleep. This is not cowardice. It is adaptation. Men cannot live constantly inside a future they cannot control, so they narrow their world to what they can endure. The body pays for it. Feet swell and blister on long marches. Illness spreads in crowded quarters. Minor wounds become major because cleaning them properly is difficult, and rest is rarely sufficient. The soldier learns that survival is not only about avoiding bullets, it is about resisting slow erosion. And through all of this, the soldier is also absorbing the empire's fragility. He sees officers argue. He sees units arrive without proper supplies. He hears rumors, because rumors fill the space that reliable information leaves empty. He hears about defeats with names he cannot place on a map, and he hears about victories that do not change his reality, because his reality is still mud, hunger, and movement. Over time, that gap between official language and lived experience becomes dangerous. Not because every soldier becomes political, but because many stop believing that the people above them understand what is happening below. And once that belief fades, discipline becomes harder, morale becomes brittle, and sacrifice begins to feel less like duty and more like waste. This is the deep truth of Russia's war effort between 1914 and 1916. It was not simply that Russia lacked resources because it had enormous resources in people and space, but it struggled to translate those resources into effective power, and the strain of that failure fell hardest on the men who could least afford it. For a peasant soldier, the Eastern Front was not a line. It was a long corridor of marching, sudden violence, hunger, and uncertainty, and the quiet realization that the empire had asked him to carry more than it could properly support. By this point, the contrast between the Western and Eastern fronts should be unmistakable. In the West, armies collided, dug in, and froze into place. In the East, armies moved, collided, withdrew, and sometimes collapsed entirely. These were not just different expressions of the same war, they were different kinds of war. And the reasons were structural. The first was geography. The Eastern Front covered enormous distances across relatively open terrain. Forests, marshes, and rivers shaped movement, but they did not channel it into narrow corridors the way the landscape of northern France and Belgium did. This made continuous trench lines difficult to sustain and even harder to defend. Where the West encouraged density, the East encouraged dispersion. This meant that front lines were thin, often porous, and frequently ill-defined. Units could slip around flanks. Gaps could open unexpectedly. Retreats could turn into long withdrawals with no obvious stopping point. The second difference was infrastructure. Western Europe had dense rail networks, paved roads, and industrial hubs close to the front. This allowed armies to move supplies quickly and reinforce positions efficiently, even when the front stabilized. In the East, infrastructure lagged behind scale. Rail lines were sparse and fragile, roads were unreliable, supply chains stretched hundreds of miles from depots to frontline units. This made sustained, high-intensity operations difficult. It also meant that once an army began to lose cohesion, recovery was slow and uncertain. The third difference was command and communication. On the Western Front, proximity allowed for relatively tight control. Headquarters were closer, signals traveled faster. Even when information was incomplete, it was often timely enough to allow adjustment. In the East, command operated at a distance. Decisions were made far from the front, based on delayed or partial reports. Communication failures were common, and coordination between armies was fragile. This magnified the consequences of error. A misjudgment in the West might cost ground. A misjudgment in the East could cost an army. The fourth difference was political and social context. Western European states entered the war with relatively cohesive societies, strong industrial bases, and political systems capable, at least initially, of absorbing strain. Dissent existed, but it was managed. Russia, by contrast, entered the war with deep social divisions, economic inequality, and limited political legitimacy. The army reflected those conditions. It carried not just rifles, but unresolved tensions. As losses mounted and hardships deepened, the war acted less like a unifying force and more like a catalyst, accelerating processes that had been building for decades. This meant that military setbacks had political consequences far beyond the battlefield. The fifth difference was expectation. On the Western Front, stalemate, once established, could be framed as endurance. Holding ground became a measure of success. The war could be justified as a test of will. On the Eastern Front, movement created a different psychological environment. Victories raised hopes. Defeats shattered confidence. There was less room to reinterpret failure as temporary, because failure often meant visible collapse. This volatility shaped decision-making. Commanders were pressured to act decisively, sometimes prematurely, because hesitation risked losing control of vast areas. Political leaders were forced to confront military reality sooner because disasters could not be hidden behind static lines. Together, these factors made the Eastern Front a place where the war's underlying weaknesses surfaced early. It exposed logistical limits. It punished poor coordination. It magnified social strain, and it revealed that modern industrial war did not merely test armies, it tested states. This is why the Eastern Front matters so much to the larger story of World War I. It shows what happens when scale outruns structure, when manpower exceeds organization, when political ambition exceeds administrative capacity. In the East, the war did not settle into a grim equilibrium. It oscillated. And those oscillations, advances followed by retreats, confidence followed by despair, eroded stability faster than stalemate ever could. For Russia, this meant that the war was not just a military struggle. It was an existential one. The front did not freeze long enough for adaptation to catch up. Losses accumulated without the psychological buffer of immobility. Each failure weakened trust in institutions that were already fragile. By 1916, the Eastern Front had become a place where the war was not simply being fought, it was being survived. And in surviving it, Russia was being changed in ways that would soon spill beyond the battlefield. The war in the East made collapse imaginable. And once collapse becomes imaginable, it becomes possible. In this episode, we stepped away from the frozen trenches of the Western Front and followed the war as it unfolded across the vast spaces of the East. We saw how scale reshaped everything, how distance, thin infrastructure, and fragile communication turned movement into both opportunity and danger. On the Eastern Front, armies did not simply clash and dig in, they advanced, overextended, and sometimes collapsed entirely. At Tannenberg, we watched German planners exploit those conditions with devastating precision, turning Russian coordination failures and communication gaps into a trap that destroyed an entire army. It was a victory born not just of skill, but of structural advantage, mobility, information, and interior lines. We then widened the lens to examine Russia itself and the weaknesses the war exposed, strained logistics, uneven leadership, limited industrial capacity, and deep social divisions that made sustained modern war extraordinarily difficult. These were not problems created by the war, but the war magnified them. And finally, we followed the experience of a Russian peasant soldier, carrying the weight of those failures on his back, marching vast distances, fighting without clarity of purpose, and living inside a system that asked for sacrifice without always providing support. Through him, we saw how imperial weakness became personal and how morale eroded not through cowardice, but through exhaustion and disillusionment. What the Eastern Front reveals is that World War I was never a single uniform experience. The war could freeze in one place and unravel in another. It could produce stalemate in the West and volatility in the East, exposing different fault lines in different societies. For Russia, the war became a stress test the empire could not easily pass. And those pressures did not remain confined to the battlefield. Next time, we'll shift focus again, not to a new front, but to a new dimension of the war. In the next episode, we'll explore how technology raced ahead of thinking, how new weapons transformed the battlefield faster than doctrine could adapt, and how attempts to break stalemate only deepen the cost of fighting. That's next time on Echoes of the Great War.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, we recommend reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark and The First World War by Hugh Strachan. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment and share us with others. And to be the first to know when new episodes and seasons are released, you can follow the show on your preferred podcast platform and on social media by searching for Echoes of War Pod.